Hello, I'm KIRK Duncan. I'm in the Master of Arts Educational Leadership K-12 Administration program at Eastern Michigan University. I'm here to present my action research project examining low achievement in a problem-based learning history class. The theoretical model used for this action research comes from the Leadership for School Improvement class taught by Dr. Gary Marks at Eastern Michigan University. The process itself is an inquiry-based process meant for school improvement plans. And what I wanted to do was take this process meant for a school and apply it to a singular classroom. So as this video progresses, different pieces of this model will appear on the screen to denote which section of the model that I was working through. The motivation for this research project stems straight from the classroom. It comes from increasing and significant pressures on teachers. Teachers are feeling the pressure of the new Common Core standards and their implementation, the causing of instructional shifts that necessitate assessment shifts. It also comes from the new evaluation processes and standards where, number one, our kids have to be successful on these state assessments. Number two, teachers have severe deficiencies in proper data usage and analysis. And it's a necessary skill in today's growth-driven evaluations. And then number three, instructional leadership. Instructional leaders are struggling to handle the en masse burdens and efficiency while still making the process meaningful and impactful for their instructional staffs. Yeah, I know personally I'm always trying to push for more rigor in my class, but it's already a rigorous class, and so I'm one that's always tried to push more ownership onto the students, and it does fall in line with the standards. However, it does concern me a bit, and here's the reasoning why. I've had a historical trend in my grading as to where there are very few middle range grades. Usually there's a whole lot of kids that do very well, and then there's a few kids that don't do well at all. There's very little in between. So I wanted to try this improvement model to really kind of target why is there low achievement in my class. So in this class that stresses 21st century teaching and learning, problem-based learning, this all leads me to my research question. Is why do students have difficulty in a 21st century teaching and learning and PBL-driven social studies class? For my sampling of participants, I started with this year's gradebook, and I dove in and found the students that were the lowest performers on my pre-assessments, and then I dove into the gradebook of last year and chose 3 classes, one from each trimester, that had the most amount of low performers. I started with 29 total participants, and I had to eliminate 5 students because of a lack of assessment history to be used for the inquiry. After a quick pattern search in the demographics and socioeconomics and also special education, with no significant findings there, I moved on to my hypotheses. The first being that these low performers were kids who struggled with reading. With the way my lesson structures worked and problem-based learning, there's a lot of self-directed learning that goes on, and it requires a ton of reading, and I always just kind of figured that these were kids that struggled with reading. My second assumption was if it was a kid that I knew was more than adequate reader, then why was this kid not performing? Well, I figured it was because this is a kid that generally just wasn't engaged with school or had a longer history of poor assessment scores. In other words, this was a kid that just normally didn't do well on tests, normally didn't do well in school, but was more than capable of doing well in school. So it's from those 2 hunches, basically, that I launched into my data inquiry. So the first stage of my action research was data analysis, and so I targeted the most recent standardized testing scores on reading of my sample group. I had 22 scores to work with here, and out of the 22, only 5 were rated as not proficient or partially proficient on this test. And out of those 5, only 1 of the students was receiving special education services for reading support, and that student had passed my class with a D. So right off the bat, my initial most strongest hunch that I've always held as why kids didn't do well in my class was they were poor readers was disproven. Now, step 2, I was on to my second assumption that these students were students that weren't engaged in school, or more specifically, just didn't like social studies, so they weren't engaged in my class or any social studies class. So I went and looked at the data on the 9th grade social studies MEP. The data on the MEP showed that 61% of the 23 students that I had scores to work with were in the low proficiency categories. They were either partially proficient or not proficient. And so this showed a somewhat of a moderate relationship, but to take a deeper look at these particular students, many of those students had expressed their preference for what we were doing in class, in my style of teaching, over their past experiences. And then a closer review of the series of test data also slightly weakens the inference as well when you cross-reference the data. Only 2 of the partially proficient readers were rated similarly to the MEP, and only 1 partially proficient social studies student rated low proficiency for reading. And then all the others were rated as proficient or advanced readers, with 1 student rated as advanced in both assessments. They were advanced in the reading, advanced in the social studies MEP, and that student had failed my class. A key aspect of the early process of inquiry into improvement is to keep asking questions and keep digging deeper into data. So with my original hypothesis of poor reading levels being disproven, and my second hypothesis having a weak to moderate relationship to achievement, I began to start to think about other performance aspects of my class. And the other performance aspects of my class has to do a lot with writing. So I went into our district writing assessments for the 8th grade, and only 2 students had multiple low proficiency scores, and only 1 of those students had the lowest rating level in all 3 of my data sets acquired thus far in the research. The 8th grade writing data showed that 35% of the students were rated in low proficiency or non-mastery achievement levels. An important part of the inquiry model for improvement is to keep digging and keep asking questions. And with my initial assumptions, I come out with not enough to go on to continue down the model, so I had to keep asking questions. And it was clear that I needed to dig into more data to find out what the actual student learning problem was. So I asked simply, what types of assessments were these apparently capable kids of doing well on? And what assessment types did they struggle with? And then what in those particular assessments were triggering the negative results? So figure 5 shows a comparative breakdown of their averages by assessment type for this at-risk group of students. And what I found was that all at-risk students were scoring relatively high on their cooperative group work, problem-based learning projects when compared to the summative content assessments. And then the at-risk students were scoring moderately lower than the rest of their peers on skills rubrics that I use to assess individuals during their group work time. It looks at the formative skill building structures and also how well they're collaborating and adding to the group process. And overall, the content portion of these project grades that were basically done as a group were much higher than the individual skills rubric scores for these at-risk students. And then the third finding is that when these students were performing independently on writing assessments, formative assessments, content checks, and theme checks during the work and after the group work was finished, their scores were very low in comparison to their other score. So after digging deep into my gradebook data, I then went and looked at project portfolios that I had stored from the year previous, and I was also observing the low performers I had in class at that time. And I felt that I had enough information to move into the next part of the model, which was to develop the student learning problem conclusion or statement. And some important information was that I did have a third of this group had low writing assessment scores, and there was some evidence of lackluster engagement history with social studies. So the most compelling data though came from my own gradebook, especially in the problem-based learning grades. They were much higher than the assessment grades. So basically the low performing students were not learning the content, and then in looking at the skills rubric scores in their portfolios revealed that there was a lack of engagement and there was a lack of what we call those 21st century skills. There was a lack of growth in that area. So, you know, the benefits of PBL is supposed to be engagement and supposed to be learning and self-directed learning and autonomous behavior, and this group of students just were not reaping those benefits. So like any teacher would at this point, you'd start to speculate about possible causes and what in the process was missing. But the great part about this model is there's space for that when you do your root cause analysis. But now that I had a clearly defined student learning problem, low performing students, content acquisition, skill building practice during cooperative group project-based learning was low, I knew that I had goals to develop and to begin to work on. So now that I had a more clearly defined student learning problem, it was time to develop SMART goals that were achievable and measurable, and then from there to really dig in and find out what the root cause of that student learning problem was, and hopefully find a problem of practice in that analysis. So with the time remaining, I'd like to go through the steps that I took to develop the root cause and the analysis it took to get there, and then that leads into developing an action plan. So for the root cause analysis, the first step was to use a fishbone diagram. And I categorized possible causes according to learner or teacher, curriculum, interaction, or school processes. So from there, that list led me into the next stage. The next stage of root cause analysis involves taking your fishbone list of possible causes to the student learning problem into an interrelationship diagram. At Dr. Marx's behest, he asked that we generate 9 possibilities. I've seen other diagrams with 5 or so, but basically this interrelation diagram works by questioning a causal relationship between each possibility. So for example, let's look at understanding the learning objective and its possible relationship to time on task. If there's no relationship between the two, then you just simply move on. But if one causes the other, you would draw an arrow from one causal factor to the other. Here we see the completed interrelation diagram I did of the root causes generated by the fishbone diagram. The ends denote that this issue was caused by another factor. The outs denote that this trait caused one of the other factors to occur. Each root cause possibility is then totaled for ins and outs. Your factors with the most outs are your true causes of your student learning problem. And this deserves the targeting when you're developing your action plan. it's very important to note that the student learning problem should generate a problem of practice. That should be your focus. In other words, your student learning problem should reveal a problem of instruction. So in my totaling of ins and outs for each issue, trait, or factor in this interrelation diagram, I found that instructional methods, grading practices, and teacher monitoring progress were my main causal factors. These were my root causes of the student learning problem. And you'll note that each one of those is directed right at me. My instructional methodology of implementing problem-based learning was not on target, it was not on cue, and it was allowing for the student learning problem to occur. In the grading practices and the how I was providing feedback and the evidence of learning that I was taking in wasn't good enough. And so the grading practices and monitoring progress go hand in hand in my eyes. So now that I had my true root causes, it was time to move on to the action plan. Development of your action plan should directly relate to your root causes and your SMART goals. My first target of my action plan was to go out and research and examine other successful models of problem-based learning, and also to dig into some research. I also needed to dig into my formative assessment strategies and to basically amp them up a bit and use them in a more formulaic way within the problem-based learning structures. Also, I needed to really dig in and evaluate my current assessments for validity and reliability. So I definitely dug into my content summative assessments and reevaluated how and what they were assessing and measuring. As part of my structures in PBL is to develop weekly project leadership meetings for every group to teach better leadership strategies to the group members that were maybe getting in the way of me seeing the at-risk or low-performing students work, and to make sure that there was some definite cooperative group leadership that was occurring, and to make sure that the amount of work was being dispersed amongst all the group members. And then basically to continue to focus on what I call criterion-driven inquiry strategies using primary source analysis and argumentative writing structures. And that also goes back to researching more assessment strategies to produce better product in writing, but also to find better research-based strategies on how to get kids to really analyze primary source documents. And I found quite a bit out there. As we wrap up this presentation, it's very important to note that in root cause analysis and what we've done here and what you've seen here, we're still at work in the theoretical. All I've generated is a few strong possibilities as to why there's low achievement. Now, taking these root causes and developing the action plan is simply testing the accuracy of my analysis. The power of using a model, it calls us back to the beginning of my research. An action plan that would have been built off of my hunches of poor reading and poor school history may have reaped benefits for a few of my students, but by using the model, I have found a more accurate, more plausible explanation for low achievement. That about does it for my time, so thank you very much for watching and listening, and I look forward to your comments. I've listed my contact information. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have further questions.